Somewhere under the ground in old Virginia, there rests a man whose name almost disappeared from history books forever. He was not a king. He was not a soldier. He never wrote a famous speech or started a revolution. He simply tried to run away. That was his only crime. And because he ran, a colonial court in the year 1640 handed him a punishment that no African man in the English colonies had ever received before him. Slavery, not for a few years, but for his entire life. His name was John Punch. And almost 400 years later, a genetic test would show that his blood runs through the veins of the 44th President of the United States. Not through his African father's side, but through his white mother's side. This is not a political story. This is not about any party or ideology. This is a story about blood, about buried history, and about an unbelievable link between the very first legal case of lifelong slavery in America and the highest office in the country. The more you dig into it, the stranger it feels, and yet the more real it turns out to be. So let's go back to where it all started. Not the start of Barack Obama's life, but the start of America's darkest chapter. John Punch thought he was just another servant trying to escape a hard life. He had no idea his choice would change history forever. In the year 1640, 3 men were caught traveling toward Maryland without permission. 2 of them were white, one Scottish man named James Gregory and a Dutch man named Victor. The 3rd man was an African named John Punch. All 3 had run away from a wealthy landowner in Virginia who had them working as indentured servants. They were captured and dragged back to Jamestown in chains to stand before the court. And this is the moment where everything changes. This is the single decision that would shape the next several centuries of an entire nation. John Punch was sentenced to serve his master for life. The 2 white men were only sentenced to a whipping and extra years added to their service. Read that again. 3 men, the same crime, the same escape. The same capture, but 2 very different punishments, based only on the color of their skin. The court's order said Punch must serve his master for the rest of his natural life, wherever that master wished. The 2 European men would eventually be free again after their extra time was served. John Punch never would be. This ruling is recognized as the earliest known case of a court legally forcing someone into slavery for life in that region of America. It wasn't just some unwritten custom that slowly became normal. It was an actual legal decision, written down, recorded, and never reversed. Many historians view John Punch as the first official slave under English colonial law, and his case is the very first legal foundation for permanent slavery in that part of the country. This is the exact spot where American slavery truly began. Not through some slow cultural shift, but through one court, one ruling, one man's name written at the top of a page. But here's where the story becomes far more complicated. John Punch lost his freedom completely. His life, as he knew it, was over. And yet, this next part is something most history classes never mention. John Punch had children with a white woman. And under the law at the time, children took on their mother's free status, so his descendants were born free. Think about what that actually means. The very man who was legally branded the first permanent slave in American history had children who grew up free, and grandchildren who became successful landowners in a colony built entirely around slavery. His bloodline did not vanish in chains. It kept going. It spread quietly through Virginia farms, through frontier towns, through small communities in the Midwest, carrying a genetic secret that nobody in the family tree likely ever suspected until modern DNA science uncovered it. Genealogists working with Ancestry. Com found something remarkable while researching the family tree of Barack Obama's mother. According to Joseph Shumway, a researcher with the company, Barack Obama turns out to be the 11th great-grandson of John Punch, the very first African documented as being enslaved for life in the American colonies. And the way the discovery unfolded is just as fascinating as the discovery itself. It began with DNA testing done by members of a family named Bunch, whose direct genetic line traced back to sub-Saharan Africa. Eventually, researchers were able to connect the earliest members of the Bunch family to a man named John Punch. Now stop and think about this for a second. Obama's father came from Kenya, and his mother came from Kansas. For years, people assumed the president had no ancestors who were ever enslaved, simply because nobody could find that connection through his father's African side. But nobody had ever done deep research into his white mother's family line. Everybody was looking in the obvious place, tracing the black father's roots. Nobody thought to look closely at the white mother from the American Midwest. And that is precisely where the truth had been hiding the whole time. The research team used a mix of DNA testing along with old marriage and property records to trace Obama's mother's ancestry. This research reportedly took 2 years to complete, 2 full years of digging through documents that had survived fires, floods, and, in many cases, deliberate destruction. Because the American South has a long, troubling history of losing records that were inconvenient to certain families. After spending over 500 hours studying documents, the research team believed they had found solid proof linking John Punch to the Bunch family, who lived in Virginia in 1640 and were ancestors of Obama's mother. And this is where the whole story shifts into something much bigger. Because Barack Obama's family history isn't just about one man's unusual lineage, it's about what America truly is underneath the surface. It's proof that history doesn't move in straight, tidy lines the way we like to imagine. It moves in strange loops that somehow pull the most unlikely people and events back together across hundreds of years. The very first enslaved man in colonial American history and the first black president of the United States, connected by blood, separated by 11 generations and nearly 400 years, joined together invisibly through a white woman from Kansas who never knew what her own DNA was carrying inside her. But this story doesn't stop in Virginia. It stretches across oceans in ways most people never fully realize. On his father's side, the story begins in East Africa. Barack Obama's paternal roots trace back to the Luo community in western Kenya, near the shores of Lake Victoria. His father, Barack Obama Sr., was born there in 1936. This region has deep traditions of oral storytelling and strong community bonds. From that world, Obama Sr. eventually made his way to America and enrolled at the University of Hawaii. The Luo people are one of the largest ethnic groups in East Africa, known for preserving their history through spoken stories rather than written records. His paternal grandfather was Hussein Onyango Obama, born in Kenya, and his great-grandfather was the son of a man named Opio and a woman named Margaret. These weren't characters from a textbook. These were real farmers, real elders, real people whose bloodline eventually crossed the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic and landed in the most powerful office on the planet. His mother, Stanley Ann Dunham, was born in Wichita, Kansas in 1942. Her parents, Stanley Dunham and Madeline Payne, carried English, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, and German roots. This is the part most people already know: white, Midwestern, American through and through. But buried within that ancestry, woven through the Irish and English and Scottish threads, was something nobody expected to find, something that had been labeled white for generation after generation. But that DNA proved was far more mixed than anyone imagined. Let's talk about the Irish side, because it's remarkable on its own. His third great-grandfather on his mother's side, a man named Falmouth Kearney, is his most recent link to Old World ancestry. When Falmouth arrived in New York in 1850, all of Obama's other maternal ancestors were already living in America. Falmouth Kearney came from a small village in the middle of Ireland, sometime between 1845 and 1851. During that period, more than 1 million Irish people fled their homeland aboard so-called famine ships, escaping mass starvation caused by a devastating potato blight, and passenger records confirm that Falmouth Kearney was among them. He escaped hunger. He escaped death. He crossed the Atlantic out of pure desperation and started a new life in America, just like millions of other Irish men and women did during one of history's most brutal famines. Barack Obama is directly descended from the Kearney family of a small area in County Offaly. This family reached its peak of success between the 1760s and 1780s, when relatives from that region took over their uncle's wig-making business in Dublin, a respected and skilled trade in 18th century Ireland. Obama's Irish ancestors were not poor farmers struggling in obscurity. They were wealthy, respected craftsmen who mixed with influential people of their time. They fell into hardship, like nearly everyone else, when the famine struck, and sent their sons overseas to survive. In May of 2011, researchers announced they had located Obama's closest living Irish relatives in a small area of County Tipperary. Real, living people today who share blood with a former American president in a tiny Irish town most of the world has never heard of. When President Obama visited Ireland in 2011, he traveled to that same village. He stood where his ancestors once lived. He shared a drink. He shook hands with distant cousins. It felt like something written for a movie, yet it was completely real. Now put all of this together, because the full picture is what really matters. One genealogist calculated Obama's ancestral makeup using approximate percentages, roughly half Luo and Kenyan, about 35% English, nearly 5% Scottish, and close to 4% Irish, about 3.5% German, under 2% Welsh, under 1% Swiss, and a tiny sliver of French. That's who Barack Obama is on paper, a precise genetic map spanning 4 continents, hundreds of years, and a dozen different cultural histories. But what the numbers alone can't show is the deeper story behind them. The story of a man who ran from slavery in 1640, whose descendants quietly lived as free white landowners for generations afterward. The story of Irish craftsmen who survived starvation and rebuilt their lives in the American heartland. The story of Luo elders on the edge of Lake Victoria whose grandson would one day sit in the most powerful office in the world. This isn't coincidence. It's something far stranger and far more meaningful than coincidence. What researchers uncovered is that America's real, raw, uncomfortable history is written into Barack Obama's DNA more clearly and more dramatically than in almost anyone else alive today. Think about what that truly means. A man who had to learn a culture that society assigned to him based purely on how he looked, while carrying inside him a genetic history that defied every simple label. His appearance told one story. His DNA told a much richer, more complicated, more historically loaded story that no single label could ever capture. Now consider a genealogical detail that stunned researchers when they found it. Census records from 1850 in Kentucky show that one of Obama's great-great-great-great-grandfathers, George Washington Overall, legally owned a 15-year-old girl and a 25-year-old man as slaves. The same records show that one of his great-great-great-great-grandmothers, Mary Duval, also owned two enslaved people, a 60-year-old man and a 58-year-old woman. So, on one branch of his mother's family tree, we find the direct descendants of John Punch, a man who was enslaved. And on another branch of that very same maternal family tree, we find slaveholders, people who stood on the opposite side of that horrifying system. Both branches exist within the same family tree, on the same mother's side. Obama's spokesperson at the time responded by saying that the senator's ancestors reflect America itself, adding that while one relative owned slaves, another fought for the Union during the Civil War, and that it shows real progress that the descendant of a slaveholder would eventually marry a student from Kenya and raise a son who would grow up to run for president of the United States. That statement barely begins to capture what this family tree actually represents. Because what this genealogy really shows is the entire moral contradiction sitting at the heart of the American story, its founding ideals and its founding crimes, living side by side in the very same bloodline, passing quietly through generations, until science finally caught up with history and revealed what had been there all along: the ancestry. Calm researchers who uncovered the John Punch connection understood exactly how significant their discovery was. Joseph Shumway stated that two of the most historically important African Americans in the nation's story turn out to be directly related. John Punch was very likely the starting point of legalized slavery in America, and after centuries of suffering, a civil war, and decades of struggle for civil rights, his 11th great-grandson rose to become the leader of the free world, arguably the ultimate fulfillment of the American dream. The origin of legalized slavery and the leader of the free world, connected by the same bloodline. That's not a metaphor. That's documented, DNA-confirmed, genealogically traced biology. But there's an important caveat that the researchers themselves were honest enough to include, and fairness demands we mention it too. Ancestry. Com added a note of caution to their findings, explaining that they cannot yet make a fully confirmed link to John Punch because of a missing gap in the historical record. Specifically, there's a missing document that would directly connect Punch to his believed biological son, a free man who, by his early 20s, already owned 450 acres of land and grew tobacco in early Virginia. There's a gap in the paper trail. The records don't provide a completely unbroken line from John Punch all the way to Barack Obama. There's a missing generation in the documentation, which happens often with early colonial records, since paper was fragile and inconvenient truths were sometimes buried on purpose. The records pick back up when one of Punch's grandsons petitioned the court for permission to marry a white woman and was denied, most likely because he appeared to be of mixed race, according to Elizabeth Schoenmills, a former president of a national genealogy society. That single detail carries a heavy weight of its own. A man born free, a successful landowner by the standards of his time, still denied the basic right to marry whoever he chose, still boxed in by the very racial system his grandfather's forced enslavement had helped create. However, the DNA evidence itself is not in question. Ancestry. Com researchers discovered that Obama's mother had African heritage while they were originally researching her European ancestry, which sparked further investigation into his African American roots. As they traced his mother's family backward, DNA testing revealed that ancestors long known as white landowners in colonial Virginia actually descended from an African man. DNA doesn't care what old documents claim. It doesn't care what a family believed about itself for generations. The genetic markers pointing to sub-Saharan African ancestry were there, quietly embedded for centuries in the chromosomes of people who had been classified as white the entire time, silently carrying the truth of where they really came from. This is what makes the story so much bigger than just one man's biography, because Barack Obama's situation is almost certainly not unique. There are countless families across America who have identified as white for generations, who built their entire sense of identity and social standing on that assumption, and who may be carrying the exact same hidden truth without ever knowing it. Genetic testing has repeatedly shown that the racial categories Americans have lived by for centuries are far more blended, far more complicated, and far more intertwined than the social and legal fictions of race ever admitted. Science doesn't recognize color lines. Science simply shows what actually happened. The movement of people, the unions between them, the passing of genes across generations, regardless of whatever laws or customs tried to control it. John Punch's children were legally considered free because their mother was white. They inherited her status. They carried her name. They lived as free people in a colony that had just legally defined their own father as a slave for life. And generation after generation, that same African DNA, the DNA of a man who ran for freedom and was punished with permanent bondage, moved quietly forward through American history, hidden inside families who believed they were something entirely different, until it finally surfaced in the most public way imaginable, inside the genetic profile of the most powerful man on earth. Obama's mother, Stanley Ann Dunham, was the daughter of Kansas natives Stanley Dunham and Madeline Payne Dunham, and the granddaughter of a man named Ralph Waldo Emerson Dunham, nearly all of them native to Kansas. For generations, these were simply ordinary American families, Midwesterners, people of the heartland who, if asked about their background, would have given the typical answer, a little English, a little Irish, maybe some German or Scottish mixed in. They wouldn't have known anything about John Punch. They couldn't have known. The records were simply too old, too scattered, and too incomplete for ordinary family research to reach that far back. But modern science can reach that far back. And when it did, it uncovered something that reshapes the entire picture. Now bring in the other half of the equation, the Kenyan father, and the full scale of this story becomes almost overwhelming. Barack Obama Sr. arrived in America after completing his studies, forming a bridge between the plains of Kenya and the United States in a way that few could have predicted. He was part of a generation of young East African intellectuals who traveled to Western universities during the hopeful early years following independence from colonial rule, men who believed education could reshape the world. He was brilliant, driven, complicated, and ultimately his personal story took a tragic turn. He met Stanley Dunham at the University of Hawaii. They married, had a son, and then separated, with Obama Sr. eventually returning to Kenya and leaving behind a child who would spend much of his early life trying to understand exactly where he came from. That child later wrote a memoir about the search, and in it, he traced his Kenyan roots through oral history and family memory, the same way Luo tradition has preserved stories across generations. His paternal grandparents were Onyango, later known as Hussein Onyango Obama, and his wife Akumu. Onyango's parents were named Obama and Nyauki. Obama was the son of Okoth, who was the son of Opio, who was the son of Otondi, according to the president's own account in his memoir. These are Luo names from Luo generations, a lineage stretching back through western Kenya, older than the Virginia colony, older than English settlement in America, older than the entire historical framework that led to John Punch's enslavement in the first place. Two completely separate histories, two different timelines, two entirely distinct ancestral paths, one rooted in East Africa, one rooted in colonial America, that finally converged in Hawaii during the 1960s, and produced a single human being who would eventually carry all of it with him into the highest office in the world's most powerful nation. And here's something that most people completely overlook. Obama's family story isn't just about Obama himself. It's about what DNA testing is doing to reshape our understanding of American history in general. Every year, more Americans send off their genetic samples to testing companies. And every year, more families discover that their sense of racial identity, the very thing many built their self-image around, is far more layered than they ever imagined. African ancestry turning up in families who believed they were entirely European. Native American heritage appearing in families with no record of it whatsoever. The scientific evidence keeps piling up quietly, showing that the racial categories America built were never rooted in biology. They were legal constructs, social constructs, enforced through law and custom, but never actually supported by genetics. In many ways, John Punch is the founding example of all this. His story, an African man sentenced to permanent slavery by a court, whose children escaped that category entirely because they inherited their mother's free status, is essentially the story of how race itself was invented in America. It wasn't a fact of nature. It was a legal decision made inside a courtroom in 1640 by men who decided one man's punishment would last forever, simply because of his skin. And from that single ruling, generations of men built centuries of laws, customs, violence, and oppression. And now, nearly 400 years later, the DNA of the man who suffered under that very decision flows through the bloodstream of a sitting president. Not as a metaphor, as an actual, measurable, biological fact. So what does all of this actually mean? What are we supposed to do with this knowledge? Honestly, we don't fully know yet. Science has moved faster than our understanding of what it all means. We can read the genetic record, we can trace the bloodlines, we can connect John Punch to Barack Obama across 11 generations and nearly 4 centuries. But what it says about justice, about history, about the strange looping nature of American progress, those are questions without easy answers. The Punch ruling set off a chain of legal changes that would eventually cement racial slavery into Virginia law and beyond. By 1661, slavery had been written directly into Virginia's legal code, drawing a clear line between white and black servants when it came to running away. The very next year, new laws determined that a child's legal status would follow the mother's condition, deepening the racial foundation of slavery even further. That legal chain reaction, sparked by the punishment of a single man in 1640, eventually became the framework for an entire system of injustice. And the man at the very center of it, the man whose desperate escape attempt set the whole thing into motion, his bloodline endured. His genetic material moved through history with a kind of indifference that DNA has toward human politics. It didn't recognize laws. It didn't recognize categories. It simply kept moving forward, generation after generation, until science finally became advanced enough to read it. What we're left with is a story that resists any simple explanation. Barack Obama cannot be reduced to just his father's Kenyan roots. He cannot be reduced to just his mother's Midwestern background. He cannot be reduced to the Irish immigrant story of the Kearney family. And he cannot be reduced to the extraordinary discovery of John Punch's blood hidden inside his mother's supposedly all-white family tree. He is all of it at once, a living record of American history in all its contradiction, brutality, and unfinished, imperfect striving toward something better. And maybe that's exactly why these DNA discoveries matter far beyond simple curiosity about one famous man's family tree. Because what they reveal is that history is never as clean or simple as we want it to be. The lines we draw between races, between nations, between the oppressor and the oppressed, are always far more blurred than the people who drew them ever believed. Blood moves through those lines anyway. It ignores them completely. It carries the truth of what really happened, quietly and without asking permission, forward into a future the past could never have imagined. A man ran from bondage in Virginia in the year 1640. He was caught. He was sentenced. He was turned into a legal category, permanent slave, a category that would go on to define and destroy millions of lives for centuries afterward. And yet his blood survived. It passed through free children, through white landowners, through Irish immigrants, through Midwestern families, through a woman from Kansas, and finally, almost impossibly, into the bloodstream of a man who would one day stand before Congress and look out at a nation still wrestling with everything that single 1640 court decision had set into motion. 11 generations, 384 years. And the DNA tells a story that the old paper records tried so hard to erase. And that leaves us with a question worth sitting with. How many other stories like this one are still buried and waiting to be found? How many families are walking around today carrying genetic truths they have no idea about? How many other bloodlines quietly connect the people who built the system of slavery to the very people who survived it, the colonizers to the colonized, the legal fiction of race to the biological reality of human beings mixing across centuries? And as these stories keep surfacing, one after another, as the science keeps improving and the databases keep growing, what will America finally choose to do with the truth? That question hasn't been answered yet, but the DNA is already there, quietly waiting to be read.